So, hi everybody. You probably don't know me, but my name is Fred Baumgarten, and I worked here for 9 years until about 5 weeks ago, when sadly, for me and for Sarah Lawrence, I moved north to Massachusetts. It might seem a little odd that I'm introducing the speaker since I'm no longer on the staff of Sarah Lawrence. I have two connections with Professor Gibbons. One is that when I was here at Sarah Lawrence and running the grants program here, we got a major grant that's still in progress for our arts and technology program. So this talk today is part of that program, and other things we've done here include the work that Una's doing in her courses, and John Yanelli getting more music technology, and a whole bunch of things, Angela Ferraiolo and all her gaming courses and computer science and stuff. So maybe some of you have taken advantage of some of those programs, which were all grant funded. So my other connection to Will Gibbons is that although we just met for the first time in person today, we share a very special bond. We're among a handful of people in the world who know who the Beethoven of America is and have studied his life and music. So you're probably wondering, what am I talking about? So this eccentric 19th century American composer, Anthony Philip Heinrich, aka the Beethoven of America, aka Father Heinrich, aka the log cabin composer, left a very faint mark on American musical history, but he did so with a certain je ne sais quoi. Once, for example, he played some pieces for President John Tyler in the White House, and upon being told that the president would rather hear a good old Virginia reel, he stormed out of the White House cursing in a strange mix of German and English. Heinrich's life also paralleled that of the bird artist and naturalist John James Audubon, in whose New York City tomb he's buried. And Will's article, A Musical Audubon, which is a study of Heinrich's bird-inspired symphonies, has been a seminal guide for my own researches. So enough about all that. William Gibbons' current research is on the relationship between classical music and video games, and his forthcoming book is entitled Unlimited Replays, Video Games and Classical Music. Will is Associate Dean of Undergraduate Studies and Associate Professor of Musicology at Texas Christian University. He holds a BA from Emory and Henry College, and his MA and PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Will's talk today, which is supported by the Arts and Technology program here, is on gamifying classical music and classifying game music. So I'm honored to introduce William Gibbons.
Good evening, and thank you all for being here. And thank you, Fred, for that fantastic introduction. He's not exaggerating when he says handful of people. There probably are literally 5 to 10 people in the world who know anything about Anthony Philip Heinrich. So it's a particularly select elite group of people. So it's been a pleasure to tour your beautiful campus today. This is my first time on campus at Sarah Lawrence. And I'd like to thank a few people who can't yet be here. But please tell Robin Starbuck and John Yanelli when they get here that I thanked them in a public way. They've been fantastic in their hospitality and for arrangements after Fred departed for Mount Holyoke. I'm also grateful to President Crystal Collins-Judd. She made some time for me this afternoon. It was a pleasure to get to know her and a little bit about her vision for Sarah Lawrence, which I think you'll all be very pleased with. So I went to a college even smaller than Sarah Lawrence, if you can believe that exists, called Emory and Henry. And I have a soft spot for liberal arts colleges like this because I think they offer unique educational opportunities for students. So when I was invited to give this talk, I immediately jumped on it. And it was only later that I realized that there was a theme called democracy in education. And when I found out, my first thought was that someone has made a terrible mistake. Surely they meant to invite some distinguished expert in political science or on the history of higher education, or I don't know, anything else but what it is that I do. Because as you heard, although my training is in Western classical music, these days I mostly study music in video games, which is hardly the first thing that comes to mind when you're thinking about democracy. But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I do have something to say about the relationship between music and video games and how that relates to the idea of democratizing education in the 21st century. So given this lecture series, it seems appropriate to start with an example from a television show all about exploring the complexity of democracy, House of Cards. In the first episode of the Netflix political drama, U.S. Representative Frank Underwood goes to a lavish gala concert filled with dignitaries, journalists, and the upper echelons of Washington society. As the concert begins with Summer from the Italian Baroque composer Antonio Vivaldi's Four Seasons, the camera fixates on Underwood's reaction. After the first phrase of music, the camera cuts to a close-up. Apparently mesmerized by the music, Underwood seems to stare intently at the off-screen musicians. But then we notice the headphones, and we realize we've been duped. Although he's still wearing a tuxedo, Frank has abandoned the luxurious surroundings and elegant company of the concert hall. Instead, he's sitting in a couch in the dark, riveted not by great classical music, but by the first-person shooter, Call of Duty. In an instant, how we perceive Frank Underwood changes. How could a U.S. congressman, a patron of the fine arts, follow up an evening at the Symphony by trash-talking teenagers on an Xbox headset? To be effective, this scene depends on the viewer's understanding that classical music and video games are incompatible. One is art, and the other is entertainment. That's a distinction that's central to both. As much as scholars have spent decades complicating ideas of what, if anything, the term classical music really means, the idea is still caught up in the conceptual quicksand of art music. In the 2002 book, Who Needs Classical Music, for example, the musicologist Julian Johnson describes classical music as music that functions as art, as opposed to entertainment or some other ancillary or background function. That opinion isn't limited to academics. As I speak, for example, the first sentence of the classical music entry in Wikipedia describes it as art music. Now then, following down that rabbit hole to the art music page reveals a circular definition: music descending from the tradition of classical music. It also tells us that art music is also known as formal music, serious music, erudite music, or legitimate music, all terms that reinforce a clear system of value judgments. At the opposite end of that spectrum, we find video games, which are closely connected with popular entertainment. Consider, for example, two frequently cited academic definitions. In a series of articles that culminated in his book, The Art of Video Games, the philosopher Grant Taverner suggests that a game must, by definition, be intended as an object of entertainment. That assumption is adopted uncritically by a number of other scholars. Gonzalo Frasca, for example, defines games as any form of computer-based entertainment software using any electronic platform and involving one or multiple players. Now, you're all smart Sarah Lawrence students, so I bet you've spotted the problem already. If we accept that games must first and foremost be entertainment products, and we accept that classical music must function as art as opposed to entertainment, then the two are mutually exclusive. By definition, they cannot be combined. And yet they are, often. That means one way or another, mixing classical music with video games always crosses boundaries and raises some pretty complex questions. Who gets to decide what music is classical? And for that matter, what counts as a video game? And what difference do those terms really make anyway? These and other questions are the subject of my new book, Unlimited Replays, which we heard a little bit about earlier. For this evening, though, I'd like to focus on a few recent examples where cracks develop in the wall between classical music and video games, and where those cracks may lead to a democratization of the very concept of art, places where groups of individuals are working to redefine classical music making into something much closer to games, and vice versa. In 2015, One of Business Insider's executive editor wrote a brief article in the magazine calling attention to a new smartphone game, which he said he was, quote, totally obsessed with beating. That might not seem like a particularly noteworthy attitude towards a mobile game. Who among us hasn't had our free time run aground in the shallows of Candy Crush or Monument Valley? This game, however, is something different. You still earn points and you frantically tap your screen, but here you win the game by correctly performing a piece of avant-garde 20th century classical music. A collaboration between the London Sinfonietta, Queen Mary University of London, and the developer Touch Press, which is now known as Amphio. This app attempts to turn classical music into just the kind of obsession that Business Insider's editor described. And it does. The New York Times reviewer, for example, found it, quote, maddeningly addictive. Now, I've been a music educator in one form or another for most of my adult life, and I am fairly certain I have never heard anyone describe learning a complicated piece as maddeningly addictive. So what's going on? Part of the answer lies with the music in question. Steve Reich's clapping music, a deceptively simple 1970s minimalist work that creates a rich and musically rewarding experience from a small amount of musical material. In fact, that's the whole piece on the screen there, just those 3 lines. It creates that experience, I'd argue, through a process not entirely unlike a video game. For example, like many games, Reich's work begins with a basic premise and a simple set of rules. One performer repeats the same rhythmic pattern throughout the piece, that's it, while another performer shifts the pattern by 1 beat every few repetitions. Clapping music is also a musical work built on a single element, rhythm, which happens to be the one element that video games handle well. Yet while many music-based video games give players the sense of performing music, I'm thinking about things like Guitar Hero or Rock Band, in the clapping music app, players are in effect reproducing the entire work. I encourage anybody with an iPhone or an iPad to download the app and give it a shot, preferably after the talk. But in the meantime, let's see a bit of the game in action. One of the advertisements for the app provides an introduction from Steve Reich himself, as well as some background information on why the app was made.
Hi, I'm Steve Reich. In 1972, I composed a piece called Clapping Music, and all it needs is your 2 hands. It's a simple piece. There's just one rhythmic pattern. One person plays it over and over again, and the second gradually changes their part 1 note at a time. This app is very helpful. It will teach you to play the piece, and it will prepare you to play it live. The goal is to follow the dots, play the pattern exactly as it's presented, but if you miss, game's over for a minute, and then you can try again. And when you're all done, just in case you're interested, you might check out a few other pieces I've written that you might enjoy. Do give the clapping music app a try. It's a bit of a challenge, but it's an interesting one, and you can download it for nothing.
So there's a lot to unpack in Reich's short statement, and we can definitely talk about that more during the Q&A. But what's most interesting to me here is that he clearly views the app not only as an enjoyable and interesting experience, but also as a gateway to live performance. As one of its original performers recently wrote, clapping music demands a different kind of virtuosity from its performers. It showcases their concentration, their endurance, rhythmic precision, consistency, phrasing within repetition, and comfort with metrical and perceptual ambiguity. The app cleverly facilitates the development of exactly those skills, and upon completing the game on the highest difficulty setting, which is really a challenge, let me tell you, players are ready to perform clapping music. That's very unusual. A number of studies have addressed video games' potential impact on the development of musical skills, like music theory or sight reading. But in Steve Reich's clapping music, the line between developing fundamental skills and actually performing music becomes blurred into unrecognizability. At some point, for both players and listeners, playing the game becomes virtually indistinguishable from a musical performance. The Steve Reich's clapping music app raises some fundamental questions about learning, performing, and consuming classical music in the digital era. How gamified can classical music get before it stops being art and starts being entertainment? And for that matter, can you perform a piece of music without intending to? Assuming that you can, the most interesting thing to me here is the way in which this app democratizes music performance. Typically, clapping music is performed by highly trained, highly educated musicians. It's a tough piece. Don't tell them I told you, but even the very talented music majors in my music history courses typically crash and burn when I use it as an example in class. But using this app in a very short period of time, anyone with a bit of dedication can master this piece and could conceivably even play it in a concert. So what does it mean to take classical music out of the hands of the experts? Are we destined for a world where everyone learns music from gamified apps? And if so, is it really still classical music at all, or is it something entirely new? Steve Reich's clapping music app asks us at what point classical music can become a game. But now, let me switch gears and explore the opposite perspective. What happens when a work of game music becomes classical? And what happens when that work invades the symphony hall? Now, it's no secret, hold on, there we go. Now, it's no secret that many orchestras have struggled financially in recent years. Dwindling audiences, insufficient charitable giving, and a myriad of other problems have resulted in labor disputes and even bankruptcies. Over the past decade or so, video game concerts have increasingly provided one remedy for orchestras eager to draw in new audiences. Once dismissed as fringe events, really gimmicks, orchestral game music concerts have become a staple of ensembles ranging from local community bands to elite professional ensembles. These concerts offer a glimpse into shifting understandings of classical music in the digital age, and they also interact in revealing ways with the symphony orchestra's traditional role as a symbol of high art. The first orchestral game music concerts took place in Japan in the 1990s. But since the early 2000s, they've become equally prominent in Europe and in North America. In terms of press coverage and critical awareness, however, 2015 seems to have been the watershed year. One widely circulated article in the Wall Street Journal, for example, noted that game music is inspiring a new generation of symphony patron that is invigorating the bottom line performance of concert halls across the US. The author, Sarah Needleman, offers examples from orchestras and performance venues across the country, noting that tickets for game music concerts often sell double the amount as normal pops concerts, and that audience members also purchase substantially more merchandise. I'm just curious for my own purposes. Anybody been to a game music concert? Okay, all right, so you're not, one time? Oh, you want to, okay, that's half the battle. All right. Aside from this short-term burst of much-needed income, however, the strategy seems to be using game music to lure younger and more culturally diverse audiences, some of whom, theoretically, go on to become regular patrons. It's too soon to know if such a strategy will ultimately be successful, but the immediate benefits to orchestras and audiences alike are obvious. We can think of this as another kind of democratization. Classical music institutions reaching outside their typically older, white, wealthy audience base to bring a much needed broader perspective on music to a much broader spectrum of audience members. It seems like a win-win scenario. But not everyone appreciates the incursion of video games into the sacred concert hall space. Needleman's article includes one such naysayer. From a business strategy perspective, it completely devalues the brand, says Roderick Branch, a 39-year-old lawyer in Chicago who attends symphony orchestra concert performances about once a week. The very idea, he says, is akin to Mouton Rothschild using its wine to make and sell sangria. Branch, who I strongly suspect is a joy to be around, suggests that performing video game music devalues not only the concert on which it is performed, but tarnishes the image of the orchestra itself. His final analogy is particularly revealing. The Bordeaux produced by Chateau Mouton Rothschild, an estate founded in the 19th century, is one of the world's most celebrated and expensive wines. Often selling for hundreds of dollars per bottle, the wine is a symbol of both quality and exclusivity, a distinctively old-world European luxury limited to a select few. Sangria, on the other hand, is a much less exalted drink. Originating in Spain via the Caribbean, this popular and delicious beverage made its way to the U.S. largely through the immigration of Hispanic peoples, leading many to associate the drink with Mexico and its cuisine. When Branch suggests that game music concerts are akin to Mouton Rothschild using its wine to make and sell sangria, he protests the use of an old, elite European product to produce a less expensive product designed for mass appeal and consumption. The analogy to the symphony is clear. Like the wine, the orchestra is a European product, a symbol of refinement and sophistication. Game music, however, like the sangria, is designed for mass consumption. While I don't agree with Branch's position, it's not hard to understand why some audience members might share his perspective. The democratization of the concert hall is a tough pill to swallow for more traditionally minded fans, not least because of how differently the music is often presented. The popular Video Games Live tour, for example, pairs local orchestras with a traveling multimedia show featuring fog machines, laser light shows, and a jumbotron playing game footage. Despite the unusual presentation, Video Games Live's impresario, Tommy Tallarico, who you can see here performing in the show, remains adamant that video game music has crossed some philosophical or artistic line and become classical music. Game music's relationship to classical composers is a recurring motif in Tallarico's interviews, with one of his most frequent claims being that Beethoven would have been a game music composer had he been born in our time. In one 2013 interview, for example, Tallarico defended game music against its detractors by claiming that symphonic game music is, quote, modern-day classical music. The only thing that's different is that all of our composers are still alive. The truth is, we're just as relevant as Beethoven and Mozart, and we're just as good. Now, I'm not sure Tallarico wins any points for modesty, but his viewpoint has a growing number of supporters who believe that symphonic game music either already is or can be transformed into classical music. But how does that process happen? How does music become classical? One simple answer would be, let people vote on it. That might sound ridiculous, but don't tell that to Classic FM, the UK-based radio station that boldly promises its listeners the world's greatest music. Every year since 1996, the station gives its audience of over 6 million listeners the opportunity to vote on their favorite classical works. From those results, the station compiles its annual Hall of Fame. In 2016, more than 170,000 music aficionados cast their votes, and as usual, the resulting list offers an unconventional perspective. For example, unsuspecting listeners might be shocked by number 17, Nobuo Uematsu's music from the Final Fantasy series of video games. Although still impressive, 17th place is actually a drop for Uematsu. In 2013, Final Fantasy reached number 3. That same year, Jeremy Sewell's music for the Elder Scrolls series of games joined Uematsu in the top 10. And as Tommy Tallarico would no doubt be pleased to point out, both of them were ranked higher than any work by Beethoven or Mozart. Game music didn't make it to the top of the Hall of Fame without help from some devoted fans with a clear agenda. For several years, there's been a concerted effort by game music fans to inundate online polls with as many votes as possible. For example, there's a Facebook group with about 2,500 followers called Keep Video Games Music in the Classical FM Hall of Fame. Alongside regular updates on game music concerts, this group issues reminders to vote in the Hall of Fame polls and reports the results. The About section for the group identifies it as an ongoing campaign for the recognition of video game scores as classical music, Fantastic music by incredible composers that deserve to be praised. Since 2015, the group has a related Twitter account, the biographical statement of which simply reads, "We campaign for the recognition of orchestral video game music." Run by two UK-based advocates, this account routinely tweets messages concerning upcoming game music concerts and recordings and serves as a communication hub for fans. The central tenet of groups like these, and there are quite a number of them, isn't simply promoting video game music. Instead, they demand a reevaluation of at least some kinds of it as classical, and therefore, in their view, worthy of serious artistic consideration. That idea is simultaneously subversive and traditionalist. On the one hand, it undermines the exclusivity of classical music by arguing for the inclusion of popular culture products under its umbrella. But on the other hand, it reinforces the fundamental principle on which classical music rests. Some music is art, and some music isn't. These groups are democratizing art, sure, but their whole mission is still built on the idea that calling something classical makes it better. In other words, the barbarians at the gate aren't tearing down the walls, they just want to come in for tea. But voting fans aren't the only ones campaigning for recognizing game music as classical. For example, in 2013, which is the same year Final Fantasy hit number 3 in the Classic FM Hall of Fame, the London Symphony played a game concert at the prestigious Barbican Centre called Final Symphony, an event that led one games writer to say, "Video game music has pretty officially made it." Removing game music from its original context and repositioning it into an illustrious and traditionally classical venue has a profound impact on audience perceptions. The musicologist James Parakilas tells us that when we're trying to figure out what type of music we're listening to, where we are can be just as important as what it sounds like. The place places it, in his words. That is, if an orchestra is playing in a venue like the Barbican Centre, then whatever they're playing is classical music. Okay, but that's not the end of the story here. I would also suggest that some game music programs, such as Final Symphony, are conceived, arranged, and marketed in such a way as to emphasize their most classical aspects. Final Symphony was produced by Thomas Becker, who runs the successful Germany-based Spielekonzert series, that's game concert series. Since his first concerts in 2003, Becker's productions have emphasized both their novelty and their classical heritage. The website is full of formally dressed musicians in elegant concert halls, like this one. The text strongly reinforces the perception of a strictly high-class affair. For the very first time, one section reads, Decca, a leading label for classical music, released a live concert recording of video game music. And with this, again for the first time, video game music reached the top 15 in the German classical music charts. Furthermore, as the site proudly proclaims, the 2015 studio recording of Final Symphony reached the top of the iTunes classical charts in more than 10 countries, and appeared in the classical album top 5 of both the Billboard charts and the official UK charts. In the same vein, instead of straightforward transcriptions and medleys, which are featured on many video game concerts, Final Symphony more thoroughly reimagines its original source material, adapting it into classical forms and styles. So there's a symphonic poem, a symphony, and a piano concerto, each based on themes from a different Final Fantasy game. Now, if you want to emphasize that these are classical works, I can't really think of better genres to do it. Symphonies and concertos in particular have for centuries been testing grounds for composers looking to be taken seriously. As for the musical style, the Final Symphony seems to draw heavily on early 20th century musical modernism, as we'll hear in just a minute. One of the promotional videos for the recording gives us a sense of the sound and features a revealing interview with Final Fantasy composer Nobuo Uematsu. Although I've made a cut, this is still a fairly long video, but I think it's important to understanding the work. And I warn you, this is in Japanese with subtitles, so if you're in the back, I don't know, squint or move forward. Okay.
子たちが音楽のアレンジに参加してもらって一言では言えないけど生まれてきてよかったなと思いますね僕が僕が始めた頃はゲーム機がまだファミコンっていうすごくシンプルなゲーム機だったんですね。ですから音楽なんかも電子音ピーとかブーとかいう電子音を3つだけで音楽を作らなきゃならなかったんですよ。でそれがだんだんこうゲーム機の進化に伴ってその電子音3音しか使えなかったのがサンプリング音源8つ使えるようになったり32個から使えるようになったりしているうちにだんだんこうそんなスタジオで録音したものもゲームに取り込めるようになったんですよ。でそういうゲーム機の進化による音楽の質の向上っていうのもあると思うんですけど、もっと大きいのはね、20数年の間にゲームを遊んだ子供たちが僕もゲーム音楽を作ってみたいと思ってこうちゃんと音楽を学んで音大の作曲家を出てゲーム音楽に就職するゲーム音楽を作るようになる時代になってきてるんですよ。ゲームのコンサートって世の中にいっぱいあるんですけど、いわゆるそのゲーム音楽に忠実なあまりずれないゲーム音楽を思い起こさせるような、聴きやすいアレンジがなされてるんですよ、大概の場合は。ファイナルシンフォニーが一番違うのはね、もっとこうアーティスティックにアートに自由な解釈されていて、なんならちょっと現代音楽に近いような部分もたくさんあるんですね。それって面白いなと。いわゆるエンターテインメントとしての音楽だったのがちょっと現代音楽風にシフトしてるぞ、このファイナルシンフォニーが。それはちょっと新しいなと思いますね。
Okay, the musical values embedded in Uematsu's message are hard to miss. Despite his own background as a prog rock musician, the composer seems to privilege classical training, or as he calls it, studying music properly in a university setting. And by separating music composed in a game music style from music written in an artistic manner, he suggests that there's a fundamental incompatibility between those concepts. That artistic manner, he implies, results from the arrangements being closer to contemporary classical music, which I interpret to mean music after about 1900 rather than specifically music being composed today. Finally, to make things absolutely clear, Uematsu points out that incorporating classical elements shifts the music away from being entertainment and presumably towards being art. Certainly, Uematsu's interview is a form of marketing. And all self-deprecation aside, Final Symphony's success translates into his own cultural and financial profit. But his tone reinforces the distinction between game music and art music, even as he lauds the arrangers of Final Symphony for transforming his music from the former into the latter. Repeatedly throughout that interview, Uematsu emphasizes the superiority of classical training and musical styles over earlier game music styles, including his own. Remaking game music into the image of classical is at the core of the Final Symphony project. So here's the question in this case. Is Final Symphony undemocratizing game music? Is it taking something that's designed for mass enjoyment and turning it into something that only highly educated, intellectually elite audiences can understand? Or something that only wealthy audiences can afford to attend? And just to be clear, Final Symphony is hardly alone in this process. Another of the most popular touring game concerts, for example, is The Legend of Zelda: Symphony of the Goddesses, An ongoing concert program premiered in 2012, which features a 4-movement symphony of the same name. It's difficult to speculate what, if any, long-term effects these more classically inspired adaptations of game music will have, or whether they'll ever gain wide acceptance as classical works. In the meantime, however, these programs, alongside efforts like the campaigns for game music and the Classic FM Hall of Fame, raise important questions about what classical music means to 21st century listeners. All right, so what are we to make of all this? I've tried here to briefly sketch a picture of two converging trends. On the one hand, we have apps like Steve Reich's clapping music, which turn classical music into video games. On the other, we have avid fans and concert performances like Final Symphony working to turn game music classical. Both instances make efforts to bridge the cultural gap that separates classical music from video games. That's a gap that already seems like it's getting smaller. Video games still, by and large, lack the cultural cachet of classical music, but maybe things are changing. Games are increasingly recognized for their capability to tell meaningful stories, to produce insightful political and cultural commentary, and to make artistic statements. Less obviously, and at a positively glacial pace, perceptions of classical music also continue to evolve. In search of financial security and social relevance, some among the classical music world have earnestly begun to explore ways to reach new audiences, including through video game music. All these signs point to a future where the artificial distinctions between highbrow and lowbrow are erased, and where games and other entertainment forms can stand alongside the art of classical music. But we're not there just yet. In fact, I'm confident that the interaction of games and classical music will continue to create friction for some time to come. However problematic or arbitrary they may be, centuries of ingrained value judgments regarding art and entertainment aren't easy to eradicate, if indeed we want to get rid of them at all. The clapping music app aims to prove that contemporary music is fun and accessible, and to help players develop the skills necessary to play it. Meanwhile, Final Symphony is still trying to show that games can be just as good as Beethoven. In both cases, they treat classical music as an aspirational goal, even as they challenge some of its tenets. The situation is similar on the classical music side. Whatever lip service arts organizations pay to increasing their accessibility and diversity, from a certain perspective, those goals are self-defeating. As the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu might remind us, a taste for classical music is a self-conscious mark of distinction. Some performers and audience members rely on classical music's aura of high-class exclusivity as proof of their own intelligence, sophistication, and wealth. Consequently, efforts to broaden classical music's appeal through games, particularly by bringing their music into concert spaces, seem bound to ruffle feathers. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my own experiences. In some settings, I still feel a palpable sense that game music research is frivolous, somehow less important or rigorous than the study of established classical music. I once had a conference presentation scheduled for the very end of a long day because, as one of the organizers cheerfully told me, they wanted to end with something fun after people were burned out from serious topics. Or consider the well-meaning colleague from another university who once earnestly told me that my application for tenure was in good shape because my legit research balances out the game stuff. As long as we struggle to define what art is and what it means, these debates over cultural value will play out over and over. What does it mean to democratize classical music or any art form? Is that goal achievable? Or are elitist ideals baked into the very concept of art? And perhaps more importantly, in an era of smartphones, Spotify, and selfies, who gets to choose what counts as art and what doesn't? There are no easy answers to those questions, but they're worth pondering because it's in that contemplation that art gets meaning in the first place. In other words, in the digital age, dichotomies like art and entertainment, high art and low art, or classical music and video games mean precisely what they've always meant: everything and nothing. Thank you. Thanks so much. Oh, no, thanks. I'm happy to, I don't know how much time we have set aside, but if anybody has any questions, I'm certain. Oh, Fred's got a question.
I have lots of questions.
All right.
I was wondering, if you could just speak, I mean, I'm sure this is a whole other area, but as someone who doesn't play video games or hasn't much, if you could speak about sort of the evolution a little bit of video game music itself, just in its own form. How much is it sort of composed versus how much, you know, at one time was just like a company put together some simple sounds and, you know, let's go along with pushing buttons. And is there any classical music, what we would call, you know, Beethoven, in certain video games?
Okay, so I'll take that as two different questions. So the first question, as I understand it, is can I just talk a little bit about the evolution of game music? So yeah, in the late 70s, early 80s, when we start to get sound in video games, it's very limited. And I'm thinking here of, you know, Atari and things like that, if anybody's ever messed around with an Atari 2600. Usually it could only play one note at a time, those early things. And if you were playing a note, then the sound effects couldn't happen and it would cut out and very strange. And the tuning system was different than the tuning system we usually hear in music, so it sounds a little bit quirky. Later on in the 1980s, you start to get things like the Nintendo Entertainment System, which is what I grew up playing. Anybody ever played a NES or something like that? Yeah, okay, good. And that could handle up to 5 different channels of music at once. So you usually would have 3 music things going on, and then there's a static channel that kind of sounds like percussion if you're thinking about like Mega Man or something like that. And I think that's when people who say, I don't play video games much, which is absolutely fine, obviously, that's sort of the point at which it sort of locks in. We imagine this sound. It's unique to arcades. And it's not until the 1990s that things really change. And that's when you get a lot of capability to have what's called MIDI, musical instrument digital interface, which sounds a lot more like traditional acoustic instruments in it. And you also start to get, later in the 1990s, you can, when we switch to CDs with things like the Sony PlayStation, things like that, you actually can have pre-recorded music on there. I'm trying to, you know, it used to take a huge amount of data to just put like one pop song on a PlayStation disc. But that was a huge thing. And all the companies at that time were really competing for who could have the best sound, who could have the best things. I learned recently that if anybody's ever played Sonic the Hedgehog on Sega Genesis, you know what I'm talking about? A few people are like smiling. You know, there was this little thing at the beginning of Sega had this little sound that would come on Genesis games. Anybody remember this? It's like Sega, right? When you would come on, right? It used 1/8 of the entire memory of that game to just have that little Sega thing at the beginning. Just because, and Sega was just sticking it to Nintendo because they wanted to show that they could emulate human voices, but Nintendo couldn't. And so it was so worth it to them to show how they were moving ahead. And so they got into this race to who could have the most notes that were sounding at once and who could have the most realistic sound. And eventually kind of peaks in the 2000s, and that's still where we are, where you can basically do whatever you want. So there are games that have dozens of hours of recorded music by an orchestra in a studio. There are now games that have gone back to that kind of retro 1980s sound. It's all over the place now. And what game composers usually tell me is they can do anything. If you can imagine it, they can pretty much do it. What's unique about game music versus, say, film music is the way in which we interact with it as players. If you think about watching a movie, I don't know, somebody name a movie for me.
Harry Potter.
Okay, well, we watch Harry Potter. Every time you watch Harry Potter, it's going to end the same way, right? No matter how much we might want Voldemort to win this time, just for variety, it's still going to happen the same way that it did. I'm sorry, spoilers. But in a game, it might vary radically. Your experience playing this game might be radically different from my experience playing this game because we make different choices. And so as a composer, you have to get out of thinking linearly and into thinking in nonlinear ways, branching music that can go different directions depending on what you're doing, that reflects different states that you're in the video game. So it requires a whole different type of thinking from composers. And very recently, I was playing a game called Dragon Age Inquisition. I don't know if anybody played this really long role-playing game. Yeah, you got it right. Nice. And about halfway through this like 100-hour long game, I was like, this music is not doing it for me. I liked it very much at the beginning, but then 50 hours in, it wasn't working. And I realized, I looked it up, did some research, and it's because they had a film music composer doing it. And he composed it as if it were a really long film. And so you're just hearing sort of the same stuff over and over and over again, as opposed to it having lots of multiple possibilities and things that were going on. It's really good music, it just didn't work really well for that particular setting. So I think that's a particularly important thing to consider when we're thinking about game music, and something that changes very much when we move it into the concert hall, because then you have to take something that's fundamentally nonlinear and shove it into kind of a linear box, so it kind of creates that. And the second part of your question was,
Is there any classical music sampling?
Yes, I'm glad you said that. So that's the rest of my book. So this is the last 2 chapters of my book. And then the first 9 chapters are about classical music in video games. And so yes, there's a lot. Way back in the 70s, it was very common because they didn't have composers dedicated for a lot of those games. So they would often just sort of grab whatever music they had on the shelf or they thought they could put in there. I'm thinking of a game called Maniac Minor, which was very popular in the early 80s. And the whole score is just a little bit of In the Hall of the Mountain King. So it's just this like dun 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 for like however long you play it, and they're just like, okay, we just knew this thing. Until now, we have games that make, I think, really clever use of classical music in a variety of forms. If anybody's ever played Civilization 4, this is one my mom plays all the time. I log onto my Steam account and there's like 600 hours of this game. I come by it naturally. And she's got like more Steam friends than I do. And anyway, it's not a competition. If it were, she'd be winning. Yeah, almost the entire soundtrack of that game is classical music that they use to indicate a specific time or place, something like that. That happens in lots of games. And then we also have a trend recently of kind of remixing classical music. There's a game that just came out recently called The End Is Nigh, which is sort of a good indie game that the whole score is remixed classical music. Same thing with a game called Catherine that came out a few years ago. It's everywhere. It's everywhere in games. So, yeah. Yes?
I mean, something I'm curious about is I was intrigued by the lawyer comment, the very
Oh, yeah.
lawyer. And like, although he definitely has like a sentiment of elitism that's not good at all, like, I think that what he's saying when he was like talking about how it's not good for business, because how many people like him are going to concert halls specifically for the like cultural cachet, not necessarily for the music.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess what I'm kind of curious about is if there's this artificial distinction between lowbrow video game music and highbrow classical music, why even try to make that move into the classical music scene? Because doing it kind of inadvertently shows a reverence for classical music that kind of supports that artificial distinction.
I think that's an excellent question. And I think you're getting at sort of the core of the problem, that they're going to trap themselves in the same quagmire that classical music is trapped in if they're not careful. And we're starting to see that happen a little bit in terms of what video game music keeps getting performed. It tends to be the same 5 composers over and over again. It tends to be the same 5 male composers over and over again, so we're sort of reifying the problems that are already there in our sort of classical canon. But I think you're right that orchestras are in a pickle with audiences, right? Because you do have he's not unusual, Roderick Branch, right? In his feeling that, I just want the orchestra to play the same 50 pieces that I like and I just want to hear them over and over again. But then you also have a group of people that are really tired of that. And so kind of figuring out how to thread the needle is really tricky, I think, for orchestras. And if they can figure that out, they're gold. Yeah. Yeah, in the back.
So what I'm going to ask is that in your lecture, you focused on pieces and games. I feel like that their music kind of lends themselves to be played in orchestral arrangements. Like Final Fantasy, for example, that's one I feel like that's kind of established as very orchestral, and even the usage of like a harp and like the famous main theme.
Yep.
But with I guess more modern gaming, so like the other end of that spectrum, like the Super Mario theme, for example, that was one that was done in like 8-bit and then on the other side of that we have, I guess, I don't know if you're familiar with a Japanese RPG franchise called Persona.
Yeah, sure.
And that's more of like kind of, I guess, like J-poppy or like acid jazz, and trying to change it up. Do you think that could lend itself to being like classified as classical.
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point. And I think that's sort of what I was going to start to get to with the previous question, which is that we're going to lock ourselves into feeling like some video game music is better than other music because it's classical, which is not, I don't think that's a road we necessarily want to go down. And I'm actually reminded, going back to sort of my film parallel, I heard a story recently from someone who works on programming with a major US orchestra, and he said they were trying to program a film music concert. And some of the orchestra members came up and said, whoa, 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 film is pops and we only play pops in the summer. This is the serious classical music. And so they got into this kind of extended arbitration between these different groups. And they ended up sort of having to go into the nitty gritty and let the orchestra sort of vote on, okay, well that one's pops and this one's classical. And so, you know, John Williams, oh, too poppy. Bernard Herrmann and Max Steiner, okay, they're, you know, legit classical composers, we can count them. You know, and so you get into this value judgment thing where you're really trying to kind of bestow this, I don't know, reverence on some particular pieces, and I do think that's a potential problem. Even in games that I think, you know, Final Fantasy, for example, which, as you say, is very symphonic in its focus. You have that on the one hand, and then even in sticking into Japanese role-playing games, which that's what that series is, you have the Tales series, for example, which is very similar in everything, except it's much more sort of J-pop influenced in its sound. There's like sort of musical numbers. It's a little bit more popular in there. And I don't know that I've ever heard music from one of those on a concert. So we're going to end up doing the same exact thing that we've done before with classical music, where we end up with this little pool of sort of approved, you know, blessed composers that we can play their music, and this other group over here that are sort of out in the cold. That being said, to play devil's advocate to my own statement that I just made, there also are a lot of video game cover bands out there that sort of take a more popular approach to the music, and they do perform a lot of that. Like I said Mega Man earlier, that's another big one. It'll take the sort of old classics and rearrange them for a band instead of for, you know, whatever. So there's a lot of opportunities out there. Yeah, other questions? More broad, general, whatever? Yeah?
You mentioned that sometimes you've had colleagues, and there being one meeting when they say this, kind of dismiss your work in studying video game music.
Mm-hmm.
How do you assert that the work that you're doing is important when you're in those situations?
Yeah, it's tricky, right? I mean, I just try to, I mean, the easy answer is I try to do my best and just, you know, try to put a good product out there, which maybe I do and maybe I don't. But I think there's also a bit of a cyclicity to it, if that makes sense. That, you know, I was talking earlier today about how in the 1990s, if you wanted to study film music, that was like, oof, don't do film music. And now that's totally normal to do a research project on that and its games. You know, if you went back to the 1980s, it was 19th century music, and no one really did 19th century music because it was just too, you know, whatever. And we sort of have this moving thing of there's always some new thing to study that just seems like wild, and you know, I see it in teaching as well, and there's been this like pattern of somebody wants to offer a class on this, and then there's like wild, you know, I see news outlines that are like, they're teaching a Beyonce class at Harvard, and oh, it's the end of the world, you know, or there's a Game of Thrones class at whatever, or there's a, you know, where we take these sort of pop culture text items and kind of look through them, and then this, you know, then that becomes passé, and there's something new going on. So I think part one, do good work. Part two, just be willing to sort of weather the storm, I think, and eventually it sort of comes out. And I say this a lot. So my first book was on opera culture in early 20th century France, and not that there's anything wrong with studying that, and I still enjoy work on that. But I was looking at my, you know, sort of like my citations thing. This is like, you know, looking to see who's Googled you or whatever. And I just look and see who's cited what that I do. And I think my top articles that have citations are all video game stuff, and you have to go way down before you get to the French thing, because it's just grabbing on to a certain popularity. Part three of that is that's not always good in my field and in scholarship in general. Sometimes it's viewed with suspicion if something you do is too popular. Sometimes, I think that's a case everywhere. So. I will say, I had, a couple of years ago, I published an article about music in BioShock video game, and popular music in BioShock, actually. And I got an email from a sanitation worker in Ottawa just out of nowhere, and he said, hey, I read this article on game studies, which is where it's published, and I just thought it was fantastic, and I loved it. And I think, I printed off this email, and I keep it every once in a while, because I think I'm so delighted that, somebody who has nothing to do with my field and just is interested in this topic read this, and it was meaningful to them in some way. So I think you find appreciation where you can. Yeah.
Sort of
Yeah, please.
a parallel of scholarship as being this sort of elite pursuit and democratizing scholarship.
Well, this is the whole thing, and taking this idea of something that we're so highly educated for and trained so much to do, and making it available to a large number of people. Not that everything any scholar does has to be accessible to everybody. It would be silly to go to a physics professor or composers or whatever and say everyone in the world needs to be able to understand everything you do. But I think there certainly is a need for democracy in education these days. I think there is a need for what we do to seem important and to seem applicable to a wide range of people. Great. Oh yeah, Robin. Hey, hello.
So in working with video games and this need to appeal to popular culture, does that reduce the potential then for complexity in the music, or having this need for multidimensionality, or does it increase that opportunity?
That's a great question, and I think it depends on how we define complexity. I think there are some forms of complexity that are going to be really difficult for people to palate. I don't know that we're ever going to have a really successful, integral serial, extremely complicated 12-tone, video game score, because that form of complexity is going to be, I think, difficult to deal with. But then, when I look at, sometimes I'll talk to video game composers and I'll say, I used to say, can you send me your score? Meaning, can you send me the sheet music? And sometimes that works, and most of the time they say, the score? You mean the file? And I'll say, okay, yeah, the file, send me the file. And I open it up, and I'm used to music looking like this, in this way, and I'll see this huge table of possible combinations of things that can happen. I was looking at, anybody ever play the Western game, Red Dead Redemption, for example? So this is, all right, nice, we got you here. So this is a game where everything all the music in the game is in the same key. It's all in A minor, and it's all at the same tempo or some variation thereof, right? So it's all either 60 or 120 or whatever beats per minute. And the idea is any music in the game can be combined with any other music in the game depending on the circumstances. And so if you're out riding in the middle of nowhere on your horse and it's sundown, that's going to give you one particular combination of these things. If you're in the middle of a gunfight in the middle of the day in this town, it's going to give you a different combination of these things. And they all have to be able to be in some way combinable. And that, to me, even though it doesn't sound complex on the surface, that is an incredibly complex underlying structure that's in there. So I think we can define complexity in a number of different ways, and the answer to the really long answer to your question is, I think yes, we're reduced in some ways in what we can do in terms of complexity, and I think you can dial it way up, in fact, in terms of other things, because you're not, if we asked a live orchestra to do that, that would be chaos, but in certain ways we can amp the complexity up because it's of the medium. Thank you, that's a great question. Yeah?
So, I'm wondering, I hear the discourse and the rhetoric of democracy, and there's a lot of kind of debate and contestation over art and music and so on. But I'm just wondering what's at stake beneath that level of discourse. I'm assuming that it's happening in some kind of competitive frame over something. I mean, I get the part that's really about the cultural capital, but just wondering if there's something more there in terms of resources or something. And the term, I don't know much about the history of the term classical music,
Right.
but I'm assuming we started using the term classical music in the era of entertainment and mass media, or it had a particular usage or meaning, right? That they come together, they belong together. It's not that this has reigned and then there's a competitor. So I'm just kind of wondering if you could fill in a little bit there.
Yeah, classical music as a term is a little bit complicated to trace historically, because sometimes it means different things at different points. In late 19th century France, they say musique classique, but they mean music that's older than 40 years old or something like that. Or it's sometimes interchangeable with musique ancienne, just old music. But I think in most places, especially in German-speaking places, the term tends to become about quality pretty early on in its history, and it becomes in the United States up till forever. It was synonymous, in fact, with sort of good music, right? They used to, in the 1920s, they would call it good music. And there's an idea of social and cultural uplift in there, that if you wanted to better yourself, you listen to classical music. We think about that in terms of things like the Mozart effect, which was popular in the 1990s, which is this really bogus scientific study that proves that kids get smarter if they listen to classical music, which led to this whole generation of expectant mothers who would like put headphones on this, and this sort of thing to try and like make the kids smarter. Yes, exactly, right, yeah. And they all tend not to be good science, but there's this lingering idea, right, that even we could take it all the way back to the ancient Greeks, and Plato thinks that certain modes make you better than other modes. The Phrygian mode makes you effeminate, and the Lydian mode makes you a warrior, and there's this different thinking about how music affects us. So I sort of lost the train of that. But I think there's, to answer your sort of the first part of your question, there are multiple levels that are really important. I mean, for me, for one thing, I think it's very important for us as individuals to question these values, to think about them. Even if we end up agreeing with where when we started, I think it's really important to say, what do I mean when I say this term? What does it really mean to call a piece of music classical? What does it really mean that I'm calling this a video game and this not a video game? This is actually a whole big thing in video games right now, is that some people will say, oh, that's not a video game, that's a walking simulator, that's not, have to be this sort of thing, And so I think it's very important for us as individuals, and in particularly from a really sort of base level thing, I think it's important for us in terms of money to be able to say what we're doing has cultural relevance. I think it's very difficult, increasingly difficult at many places to justify what we do if we can't show that it somehow does something for more than 2 or 3 people in the world. I'm not saying it's a little bit neoliberal, and I'm not saying it's fantastic, but I think many times we see this. I was talking about this earlier with philosophy. Lots of places in the country, philosophy programs are getting cut because it's very hard to show that there's an actual quantifiable value to studying philosophy. Now, it seems obvious to me what the values of studying philosophy are, but it's less obvious if you are looking for clear numbers. So I think maybe this is because I'm an associate dean now and I think about these things sometimes, but I think it's very helpful to us if we can say, look, this classical music program brought in 4,000 people. 4,000 people came in, 150 of which have never heard a concert before in their life, and they heard this music and it interacted with them. And it's sort of like going on Facebook, right? What's the outreach? What's the reach of this post that I did? And you think, I did this post and it reached 2 people. Well, that was not very effective. I did this post and it reached 10,000 people. That's good. So I'm not saying that's the be-all, end-all of art, and I certainly don't want to sound totally mercenary about it, but I think it's a little bit irresponsible, especially if we're talking about arts organizations, to not at least consider that and think about that. I don't know, I also think we have an ethical imperative to think about issues of diversity and representation in our musical repertoire, and this is, I think, in my mind, one way to do it. There's a lot of talented people who are women or people of color who are composing video game music, and to me that seems like a pretty easy case for programming the music.
Yeah, because in my mind it seemed more kind of logical to think video games will do more for classical music than in reverse. But of course, it's kind of interesting the way it plays out in terms of the values attached, kind of across historical periods to that concept of classical music. I think in terms of looking at the market and so on, video games are really nice. Anyway,
they're huge, and you make a good point, right?
But like the comment about, from your colleague,
Yeah.
That perception is really at odds with some of the market statistics.
No, you mean, yes.
Interesting, yeah.
Yep.
I just have to say, as a classical music, as someone who likes classical music, I sort of hate the concept of classical music.
Yeah.
And in particular, the radio stations in this area, just, I hate their whole sort of cachet of, we're classical New York, and we're gonna play, Peer Gynt's Sunrise 10,000 times, and so I hate that piece of music, it just drives me crazy that it creates that sort of elitism and lack of diversity and all those kinds of things. So I'm very much in favor, as much as I love listening to classical repertoire. I mean, I'll never not like hearing it, but I'm very much in favor of broadening the definition of music, let alone classical music, to be much more inclusive. There used to be a great radio show that Peter Schickley's PDQ Bach did for a number of years. That was where he'd always sign off by something like, if it sounds good, it is good, or something like that. And he always played a very broad array of jazz and interesting stuff whenever he has, from classical to everything. Sorry.
Yeah. He always did this thing too that I still play this for my class all the time, which is he would do this sort of fake classical thing he'd sort of make fun of these stations doing the same thing, and I always liked that he would play some little Mozart something and it would say, classical music, you're listening so easy you don't even know you're listening, or whatever, and it's this whole, but I think there's a lot to that. There's a lot of problems in the field, and this is just my sort of tiny lens onto it. But it's classical music needs to be saved from its devotees. I will say I complain so much about. We're going to have to edit this out of the video, but I complain so much about our local classical music station that they put me on the board of directors, because one of the guys I know who was on the board just said, "Okay, you're going to put your money where your mouth is." And so I just started recently, but I already let it be known that I'm going to be that guy who is just complaining about everything, and we need more of everything. It's a very strange idea to me. It's like going to the movies and just wanting to see the same movie over and over again with different actors. I don't know, very strange. Sorry, you've had your hand up like 5 times.
I was just curious, when you were talking about composers thinking of the piece as like a score versus a file. I was just curious if there's any movement to sort of analyze video game music, like maybe Umatsu's, which sort of lends itself to an orchestral setting. If there's a movement to sort of analyze that within like a common practice framework. I think a lot of like the elitism within classical music, even before the advent of video game technology, comes from how music can be theoretically analyzed.
Yeah, I know maybe 5 or 6 music theorists now who that's their thing, is sort of analyzing video game music. And sometimes it is sort of straightforward, but then what I've most appreciated are the people who have kind of developed new ways of thinking about it. So Elizabeth Benita Gray, for example, she teaches at Ithaca College. But her big thing is that she studies smoothness in these different sort of ways that things can combine, lots of statistical analysis that's going on, lots of really interesting ways of thinking about how different pieces can go together. I've seen Steve Reale, who's a professor at Youngstown State in Ohio, has some really beautiful scores where he kind of simulates the level of a game and then creates musical scores that go on top, so you can see how they relate to what they're doing. So I think theorists are coming up with some really fascinating ways of doing it. And there are just some straightforward, really common practice, let's look how this works. And it's mostly Final Fantasy and some Zelda and things like that just say this is musically what's working here.
Yeah, it's just interesting to think that there's still music that came out in like the mid-20th century that was made for an orchestral setting, whatever that means, but that's still just now being taken seriously in like a theoretical way. And that there's now orchestral music for video games that's...
Oh yeah, I agree. Figuring out how to analyze it is tricky, and part of it is just getting a hold of the scores, whatever that means. And to go off on sort of a tangent, it's very difficult just from a copyright point of view sometimes. I was just giving a very similar talk to this in Michigan in January at the North American Conference on Video Game Music, which is fun if anybody ever wants to go. and the other keynote speaker was Marty O'Donnell, who's a composer for the Halo series of games and Destiny and this sort of things. And so at dinner I was saying, you know, where are your scores? How do you get to do them? And he says, I don't know. I don't know who has the rights to them. People ask me, and I tell them I don't have the rights to them. They have to talk to the company, and the company says, we don't have the rights to them. You have to talk to this other person. And I think a lot of times they just never thought it would be a thing. And so nobody thought about who has the rights to use this music for whatever. And so a lot of video game companies, for sort of legal safety reasons, just shut it down and just say, no, you can't see that. You know, well, why? Well, I don't know. We're just not going to worry about it. And so it creates some really unique, interesting challenges. It's similar in film, but yeah. And trying to get television scores is a nightmare too. Yeah.
It seems like for a medium to be taken seriously, it has to fall into this kind of criteria that for it to be considered as like bridging the gap between art and entertainment.
Yep.
Do you think that there's like a way, or like there's like within like thinking about video games, if that criteria is going to be broken over time, or if we're going to just keep going along with this trend as we consider it, and
Yeah.
video game music and video games themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think about this in terms of games themselves. You know, there's this whole thing with Roger Ebert. You might know who Roger Ebert is, the critic, where I think several years ago he had this whole thing where he just said video games can never be art. Like, it's just not possible for them to be art. And he sort of goes down this whole, you know, reason why, and there's market reasons and there's, you know, other reasons. But he's very sort of final about it. And I think it's wrong of us to sort of reject an entire medium and just say this can never be art, right? You know, we might not think crayon drawings on a cocktail napkin could ever be art, but maybe they are in the right case, in the right circumstance. I mean, you know, art was dealing with this back with Marcel Duchamp and the Fountain and things like that. You know, what's art? And I think they're starting to be taken a little bit more seriously. I think we're starting to get games that people talk about in terms of art pretty regularly. If there's any sort of halfway sophisticated game, somebody will say, this is the game that proves they can be art. There's a whole great website, a Tumblr page, if anybody wants to look at it, called the Citizen Kane of video games. And it's this whole thing of times where critics have said, when will we have the Citizen Kane of video games? And it's just like this like recurring thing where we just keep asking. And to me, we will never have the Citizen Kane of video games because, you know, you can't replicate one medium in another medium. And so they mean, when will we have this sort of watershed moment that proves that games can be art? But I think it inadvertently connects it to another medium. Games are never going to be as good at being films as films are at being films. So you sort of have to learn how to judge them in different ways. I think they're getting more recognition, and I think they're getting more narratively complex, which is what we usually mean when we say something's art. But there are games that I certainly personally, individually consider to be an aesthetic experience. Journey is a good example of one, if you've ever played that. It's this very contemplative, sort of philosophical game. Others like that. But yeah, I don't know what it will take. Game music is in some ways ahead of games, I think, in terms of being considered artistic. And I don't fully understand why that is. Maybe it's because games care less about being taken seriously than the music does, for whatever reason. I don't know. Oh, yeah, in the back again.
Sorry, what I was going to say is that, I mean, in terms of the whole games, like, you know, not being classified as art or, whatever you basically as films, I guess, like, if you've ever played The Last of Us, and like, I guess this is more like kind of, very bullshit with the original topic, but the argument that nowadays single player games are kind of going to die. What are your stances on that, and how it connects to, you know, video games not being art?
Yeah, I have several thoughts about that. I mean, we do hear that single player games are going to die, and I don't know that that's true. I still think we'll hold on, although it's harder to monetize them in some ways, which is why everyone says they're going to die. It's easier to monetize multiplayer games because you can do microtransactions a little bit more easily because you got to compete with other people. So I think there are several points to that. One is that single-player games usually are better at narrative because, in multiplayer games, there's just a whole different can of worms that you have to think about in terms of what's going on when you coordinate multiple people together, and that's a real problem musically speaking. Thinking about World of Warcraft, for example, which I've never actually played myself because I would never come back again, is person X is playing this game and hearing one set of music. Person Y can be in the exact same room doing the exact same things and hearing different music, radically different music, because it's sort of randomized what you're going to hear at certain times. And so it makes it very difficult to think about moments lining up, moments of synchronicity where this is specifically tailored to this one specific thing. And it becomes much more sort of aleatoric in the sense that there's chance elements to it. So I think that'll be tricky. And I think if we get to a situation where there's multiplayer is really the dominant form and we have to consider whether that's art, I think it'll take some real rethinking about what art is and how art can be a collective experience rather than a solitary experience. Any other questions? Okay, I'm happy to stay around and talk to people individually for a while if you have anything to do, but thank you for listening. Thanks. Thanks so much.